A struggling single dad helped a lost tourist girl, then found out she owned the hotel he worked at. What would you do if a stranger knocked on your door at midnight, soaked, shivering, and unable to remember who they are? In a city that feels anything but familiar on a freezing autumn night, Ethan Martinez just wanted to end a long day in his worn-out chair at apartment 4B. But when the hallway lights flickered and a trembling voice called from the other side of the door, everything changed. Do you have enough trust to open the door for someone with no name, no past, but who might change your future forever? Comment below, what would you do if you were in Ethan's shoes? And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss any of the heart-touching stories, just like the one you're about to hear. Take a deep breath. You'll hear the rain, the knock, and your heart start to race. Ethan Martinez never thought his life would be defined by the hum of a vacuum cleaner and the lingering scent of bleach. But that was the reality he lived every day at the Crescent Pine Inn, where endless, nameless hallways were the only world he truly belonged to. He never complained, because beyond the night shifts, beyond the calloused hands and sweat-soaked shirts, there was Isaac, his 7-year-old son, whose eyes were as clear and hopeful as a Monday morning. A simple sandwich and Isaac's smile were enough to make Ethan forget the guest who had just yelled at him for folding the towels the wrong way. But that night, something changed. His shift ended later than usual. As he walked across the empty parking lot, mentally counting whether he had enough money left to buy milk for Isaac, a strange sound made him stop. A quiet sob, barely audible. He turned. Near the emergency exit behind the hotel, a spot almost no one ever passed through, sat a woman slumped against the wall. Her dress was dusty, one shoe missing, her face pale, as if every ounce of color had been drained. Ethan hesitated. He knew this wasn't part of his job. But when she looked up, with tear-filled, disoriented eyes, every excuse caught in his throat. "You work here, right? I don't know where I am." That sentence, simple as it was, stirred something in Ethan, not out of curiosity, but because he knew what it felt like to be lost, alone, in a world that doesn't seem to care. He had no idea this woman was Victoria Lewis, heiress to a hotel empire, and even less did he know that sitting down beside her that night would be the first step in a chain of events that would transform both their lives. Because sometimes a stranger doesn't come into your life to break it apart, but to make it whole. Elmbridge Station isn't a place for dreamers after midnight. The wind howled through the cold concrete steps, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, as if the city itself was too tired to care. Ethan Martinez, his thin jacket soaked from the rain, had only meant to stop by and grab a carton of milk for Isaac. But instead, he saw her. She stood like a smudge of ink against a gray canvas. Victoria Lewis, pale-faced, dress-stained, arms wrapped tightly around herself, not just bracing against the cold, but against something far deeper, something like an invisible loss. Ethan meant to walk past. This wasn't his problem, but in the moment their eyes met, something inside his chest tightened. I don't know where I'm going. Everything just keeps slipping through my hands, like this rain." She didn't cry when she said it, and that was what made Ethan stop. He'd seen people break down before, but the ones who had no tears left to cry, those were the ones sinking the deepest. He didn't know who she was, didn't care. All he knew was, he couldn't let someone disappear from his life like this. The real question was she the one who needed saving, or was it him? Ethan couldn't quite remember when he made the decision. All he knew was that by the time he opened the door to apartment 4B, the second pair of footsteps behind him no longer felt unfamiliar. Victoria Lewis had stayed silent the entire walk back, but the slight trembling of her shoulders beneath his jacket said more than words ever could. In the small kitchen, the soft glow of the warm yellow light fell across the table, where half a sandwich still sat. Isaac, hair tousled and eyes barely open, stepped out of his room mid-yawn. "Dad, who's that?" "She got lost. She'll stay for a bit, okay?" Isaac nodded, surprisingly alert. If she's hungry, I saved half a cheese sandwich in the fridge. Victoria froze. Not because of the offer, but because it had been so long since anyone gave her anything without expecting something in return. And why was it that something so small made her want to cry? Ethan handed her a blanket, saying nothing more. He didn't ask where she was from, didn't pry. But as he turned toward his room, the last look he gave her wasn't pity. It was something she hadn't seen in years. Trust. The apartment fell quiet again. But something in the air had changed. It was no longer just a shelter for a father and his son. It had become a place where an invisible connection had just begun to take root. The question was no longer, who needed whom more? But rather, were they ready for something they never planned for? That morning, sunlight streamed through the small window of apartment 4B, casting soft lines across the worn tile floor and a pair of high heels neatly placed by the rug. But Victoria Lewis was gone. No goodbye, no note. Just the towel she'd used to dry her hair, now folded carefully over the back of a chair. Ethan stood staring at the empty spot where she'd sat the night before. Strange. She'd only been there one night. No full name, no past. And yet somehow, the room now felt too quiet without her. Isaac, on the other hand, was unfazed. He asked just one question. Where did she go? Then went back to drawing a dinosaur with long, flowing hair. Ethan gave a faint smile. That question, maybe even he wasn't ready to answer. There was something about her he couldn't shake. The way she sat upright, even when exhausted. The way she held a glass of water with both hands like someone trained in etiquette. And those eyes, always alert, as if she'd lived too long in a world where trust was dangerous. Who was she? Why would someone like her be wandering through a train station at midnight? No wallet, no phone, no clear reason. There were no answers. But Ethan knew one thing. If fate had brought her to him once, it could happen again. And next time, if that moment came, would he have the courage to ask her to stay instead of just helping her pass through? The Avalon Regent Hotel glowed with the kind of perfection Victoria Lewis once believed defined success. Staff lined up and bowed in unison, soundproof boardrooms, espresso brewed at the precise temperature. Everything was flawless, and yet, none of it felt right anymore. Her laptop screen displayed a personnel file. Ethan Martinez, head of housekeeping at the Crescent Pine Inn, a modest hotel on the edge of the city. The same place where Victoria had once fallen asleep on a worn-out sofa, beside a dinosaur-loving little boy and a man who had no idea who she was. He didn't know, but she did. Victoria's hand tightened slightly when her eyes landed on his monthly salary. A number so unremarkable, it felt like an insult to the dedication she had witnessed firsthand. The man with tired eyes who still folded blankets with care. The father who rose early to make breakfast with 2 slices of bread and a single egg. She had traveled the world, but she had never met anyone like him, and never seen a world so cruel to someone so kind. The branch director walked in and asked, "Which areas would you like to begin the audit with, ma'am?" Victoria looked up, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Start with the personnel files and find out why Ethan Martinez hasn't been promoted yet." She wasn't here as a CEO. She was here as someone who had once been helped, and now it was time to return the favor, in her own way. 3 days later, Ethan walked into the manager's office at the Crescent Pine Inn, still holding the cleaning towel from his morning shift. He thought he was being called in for a scheduling mistake, or maybe for missing a report. But the manager simply slid an envelope across the desk, eyes still fixed on the screen. "Congratulations. You've been promoted. Housekeeping supervisor, starting next week." Ethan stood frozen. No warning. No one asked his opinion. To him, good things often came with a hidden catch. He opened the envelope. The number inside wasn't huge, but it was more than he had ever dared to hope for. Why? Who was behind this? He stepped out of the office with his mind spinning. Inside him was a strange mix of suspicion and gratitude. But somewhere deep down, a quiet voice whispered, "Was it her?" That afternoon, after wrapping up his shift, Ethan walked past the front lobby and saw Victoria. Not in the worn-out jacket anymore, but as a version of her he never imagined, with the same eyes he once knew, now carrying a different kind of glow. A woman in power, in control of the very building he worked in. And in that moment, Ethan understood. Their worlds had never been as separate as he once thought. The only question now was he ready to face a version of Victoria who knew him better than anyone else ever had? Ethan had never felt smaller than he did standing in front of Victoria in the lobby of the Crescent Pine Inn. She wore a black blazer, tablet in hand, speaking with the manager about human resources restructuring like it was a battlefield. And she was the general leading the charge. She smiled when she saw him, but Ethan didn't smile back. "A promotion?" he said as he stepped closer, voice low and cold. "You think I couldn't earn that on my own?" Victoria paused for a split second. The nearby staff pretended not to hear, but no one walked away. "I didn't do it to insult you," she said quietly. "I see the value you bring. Or maybe you just feel guilty for spending the night at a janitor's apartment?" The words sliced through the air like a blade. Her eyes darkened, but she didn't argue. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding. He hadn't wanted to say that, but he didn't know how else to protect his pride. He liked her. More than he was supposed to, and that was the real problem. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was distance, and they both knew that unless one of them said what needed to be said, these growing feelings would die before they ever had a chance. The question was no longer who was right or wrong, but rather, is there room for love in a world where status and distance always come first? Since the day Victoria officially took over operations at the Crescent Pine Inn, the hotel had transformed in ways no one expected. Night shift staff were given hot meals. The employee break room got a fresh coat of paint, and the vending machine that had eaten people's change for the past 3 years was finally replaced. Everyone was grateful, except one person. Ethan Martinez. He didn't slow down, didn't say thank you. He just kept doing his job, quietly, efficiently, as if none of the changes had anything to do with him. Victoria noticed. She stood on the fourth-floor balcony, holding a stack of files, watching Ethan below as he carefully guided a new employee on how to properly sort cleaning chemicals. He was precise, serious, and so distant it bordered on cold. Had she made a mistake by stepping in? Or worse, had she hurt the one person who once treated her like a regular human being? During the evening meeting, Victoria pitched a trial policy. No uniform day, letting staff show off their personalities through what they wore one day a week. The room broke into laughter and chatter. Everyone seemed amused, except Ethan. He didn't look at her once. "I didn't come here to be pampered," he had once said. "I came here to work." Just when Victoria was beginning to wonder if it was time to pull back, Isaac ran into the front lobby, a bag of pastries in his hand, calling out, "Dad, Miss Victoria gave our whole class pumpkin porridge today. It was so good." Victoria froze. So did Ethan. Some connections don't need adult approval to exist. Sometimes it's the smallest hearts that hold the thread between two worlds that were never supposed to touch. Lucas Turner showed up on a gloomy afternoon, as if even the weather knew something was about to shift. Gray suit, polished shoes, and eyes that assessed people the way he might scan a spreadsheet. Something to be processed. Ethan was checking inventory in the supply room when Lucas walked in. No invitation, no hesitation. "We need to talk. About Victoria." Ethan closed his notebook and stood upright. The two men faced each other, like polar opposites who'd never learned how to exist in the same universe. Lucas paced slowly around the room, his eyes flicking over the peeling paint on the walls. "I'll keep this brief. You're a good man, but don't forget your place. She belongs to a world you can't step into without being scrutinized for every move you make." Ethan gave a dry, quiet laugh. "She once sat on my torn-up sofa, eating hard-boiled eggs Isaac made. No one asked where she belonged then." Lucas tightened his grip on his briefcase, his voice cold and sharp. "One night of being lost doesn't rewrite an entire life, Martinez. When the game ends, she'll return to where she came from. You, on the other hand, have nowhere to return to because you never left." The door shut behind Lucas, but the weight of his words lingered, bitter and biting. Ethan stood alone in the dim room, where the dull lighting couldn't hide the truth. He'd let his heart go further than was safe, and now the real question wasn't, will Victoria return to her world, but rather, does he have the courage to hold on to her when the world is trying to pull her away? Ethan Martinez didn't make an appointment. He didn't call ahead. He walked straight into the lobby of the Avalon Regent Hotel, where Lucas Turner was busy directing staff for an upcoming high-stakes shareholders meeting. Lucas looked up, momentarily surprised. Ethan wasn't wearing his janitor's uniform. He didn't lower his head. His eyes were steady, his voice firm. "You're wrong. Victoria doesn't need you to protect her from me. She just needs to be seen, as a person." Lucas tilted his head, offering a thin smile sharp as a blade. Didn't know the janitor had thoughts on humanity. Ethan took a step forward, his tone dropping. "I've seen Victoria struggle to fold a towel. I watched her fumble with an old microwave and light up like a kid when she toasted her first slice of bread. That wasn't some corporate heiress. That was a woman learning how to live. For real." Lucas faltered, just slightly. Ethan continued, now more certain. "She doesn't belong to any world, because for the first time in her life, she's choosing to build her own. And I believe I'm the only one who's ever seen that happen." The space between them tightened like a drawn bowstring. Lucas didn't respond right away, but for the first time, the arrogance in his eyes dimmed. Ethan turned and walked away without waiting for a reply. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is believe in the goodness someone else has never been allowed to show. Victoria Lewis sat alone in the luxury suite on the 27th floor of the Avalon Regent Hotel, surrounded by high-end furnishings and floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the glittering city below. Everything around her was perfect, and yet inside, she felt an emptiness so vast it was terrifying. On her laptop screen was the expansion plan for the Tokyo branch. She scrolled through line after line, but couldn't remember a single thing she just read. All that lingered in her mind was the image of Isaac scrunching his nose at the too sweet pumpkin porridge, and Ethan, growling like a dinosaur just to make the boy laugh. A knock at the door startled her. Room service had arrived. A royal tier breakfast, golden croissants, imported raspberry jam, cold-pressed juice. Victoria stared at it for a moment, then pushed the entire tray into the trash. "I can buy everything, except the feeling that I just let something truly important slip away." She stood, walked to the closet, and pulled out an old hoodie, the one Isaac had drawn a dinosaur on with a marker. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded it into her suitcase. For the first time in years, she wasn't chasing expectations. She wasn't following a mapped-out path. She was listening to one thing only, her heart. And that heart wasn't in New York, wasn't in the boardroom. It was in apartment 4B, with a man who saw through her when the rest of the world only saw a title. The door to apartment 4B shook gently under 3 hesitant but deliberate knocks. Ethan Martinez wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. But when he opened the door, he saw the last person he ever thought would return from a world that seemed forever out of reach. Victoria Lewis, her hair loose and slightly messy, face bare of makeup, both hands gripping the straps of a canvas bag like letting go might make her change her mind. "I resigned," she said, skipping any greeting. "The entire system, turned over to the board. The penthouse returned. Next month's meeting's canceled." Ethan didn't speak, not because he didn't believe her, but because he was trying to understand. Why would someone who had everything give it all up for something as fragile as a feeling? Victoria met his eyes, her voice barely holding steady. "I don't really know what I'm doing. All I know is every morning without hearing Isaac scream about his missing T-Rex socks feels incomplete. And every night without hearing you tap your coffee mug feels like something's missing. Something I can't replace with any accomplishment." Silence filled the space between them. A soft breeze from the hallway drifted through, carrying with it the familiar scent of Ethan's slow-cooked stew. And then he opened the door wider, saying nothing. But his eyes said everything. "Welcome home." Because sometimes the reason someone dares to give up everything is simply to be with the one person who makes them feel like they have everything. No one taught Victoria how to scoop coffee with a barely clean plastic spoon. No one showed her how to sidestep sharp Lego pieces scattered across the floor like tiny landmines. But she learned through watching, through patience, and through a kind of affection she had never known how to name. On her first morning in apartment 4B, as someone who stayed, Victoria clumsily cracked an egg against the bowl, only for the yolk to spill onto her sleeve. Isaac saw it and burst out laughing. "Miss Victoria, that is not a CEO skill." Ethan, sipping his coffee, held back a grin, casting a glance at her over the rim of his mug. But Victoria didn't flinch. She simply stuck out her tongue at Isaac, looking more like his classmate than the former head of a hotel empire. That afternoon, they built a dino fortress out of pillows, blankets, and dining chairs. Victoria, pants caught, hair a mess, chocolate smudged on her cheek, sat in the middle of the bunker, shouting, "Isaac, you have to defend the west side. The invaders are closing in." The boys shrieked with laughter. Ethan leaned against the doorway, not joining, just watching quietly. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't see a woman out of reach. He saw someone who simply belonged. Victoria turned and caught his gaze. She didn't speak, just smiled. A smile that needed no explanation. Because some connections don't need effort to exist. They're just the right people at the right time. The headline on the morning papers stunned the business world. Victoria Lewis steps away from Avalon Regent Hotel. Chooses simplicity over the hospitality throne. Speculation spread like wildfire. Some claimed she'd been forced out. Others whispered about a secret romance scandal. But no one guessed the truth would be so beautifully ordinary. She walked away from an empire for a reason no one in any boardroom could understand. To cook breakfast, read comic books, and hear the laughter of a little boy who now called her Dino Sister. Lucas Turner called, more than 6 times. Her father from the Manhattan headquarters sent an email laced with urgency and quiet rage. She replied with just one sentence. "For the first time, I'm not trying to become anyone at all." In the small kitchen of apartment 4B, she wiped the table, adjusted the salt shaker, and turned on the toaster. No meetings, no assistants, just the sound of Isaac running toward her with a brand new drawing in hand. Our family of 3, riding a cloud on a dinosaur. Ethan walked in, phone still in hand, the news headline fresh on his screen. He hesitated, unsure what to say, but before he could ask, Victoria turned to him and smiled. "I'm not a CEO anymore, but maybe, for the first time in my life, I know who I am." And in that moment, Ethan understood. Sometimes the most surprising thing isn't that someone chooses you, but that they choose themselves, and still choose you to walk beside them. Ethan Martinez once believed his heart had shut down for good, like the door to an old room no one knocked on anymore. But that afternoon, as he stood with Victoria and Isaac beneath the old oak tree by the small yard, and his hand instinctively reached for hers, he realized, some doors don't need a key, only the right person standing in front of them. There was no grand proposal, no wedding covered by the media, just quiet weekend mornings filled with the smell of slightly burnt toast, with Isaac's laughter echoing as they made dinosaur sounds and wrestled on the floor, and small, sacred moments, like Ethan silently pulling out a chair for Victoria at the breakfast table, a gesture simple but full of love. They weren't trying to prove anything, no deadlines, no promises carved in stone. Just a life slowly built, piece by imperfect piece, a life that felt like theirs. One evening, while Victoria was folding Isaac's clothes, he looked up and suddenly asked, "Are we a family?" She paused for a moment and looked toward Ethan. He nodded slowly and said, "Family doesn't mean being the same. It just means not giving up on each other." Isaac smiled, and from that moment on, the 3 of them, a man who had once lost faith, a woman who had once lived behind glass, and a little boy who believed in dinosaurs, walked forward into a new life, a family not born of blood, but of choice, and they chose each other every single day. The sunset painted Lake Greenwood gold, like a mirror reflecting the journey 3 strangers had walked together. On the small balcony of apartment 4B, once home only to silence and a broken chair, now echoed with Isaac's laughter, his hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa, a streak of milk foam still clinging to his upper lip. Ethan stood behind him, gently draping a light jacket over his son's shoulders, while Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. Her eyes softly closed as if, at last, she had found her place of true peace. "There aren't any dinosaurs in this lake, Mom," Isaac whispered, then added with a sly grin. "But maybe there's a little family living happily nearby." Victoria laughed, freely, completely. Ethan gave her hand a quiet squeeze, saying nothing. He didn't need to, because the miracle wasn't in grand gestures, but in someone choosing to stay, a child brave enough to trust, and a man learning, for the first time, how to open his heart. Their story wasn't a fairy tale, and that was what made it real. Imperfect, beautiful, and worth believing in. What about you? Would you be brave enough to leave behind the old world to choose something simple, but completely true? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in their journey touched you the most? And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the stories that speak to your heart, where every ending is just the beginning of something more beautiful. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story. Sometimes life makes us believe that success is measured in big contracts, luxury apartments, or first-class airline tickets. Victoria Lewis once lived in that world, where every decision was calculated by profit margins, and every deviation felt like a risk of losing control. But it was only when she found herself lost in the rain, without a phone, without an address to return to, that she discovered what truly matters: genuine human connection. Ethan's story, a single father quietly working every day for his son, reminds us that value isn't found in titles or income, but in resilience, kindness, and unconditional love. He had nothing to offer Victoria, except a place to stay, a warm breakfast, and a gaze without judgment. But it was those simple things that saved her, in a way no corporation with hundreds of employees ever could. And Isaac, the child with a world full of dinosaurs, became a symbol of something magical. Real connection doesn't need a reason. It just needs an open heart. This isn't just a love story, it's a reminder. Sometimes to find true happiness, we don't need to run faster, climb higher, or earn more. Sometimes we just need to stop, to listen, to choose what brings us peace. Because happiness isn't something found in the spotlight. It's the moment we realize we're no longer alone.